Hello, hello, hello. My name is Chandler Poling, and you are in the Film Music House at the Sundance Film Festival. I'm very excited to present this next panel, which is all about making soundtracks, what goes into it, the thought process, the execution, the production, distribution. We are here to talk about it all. And with me today, we are going to use the case study of The Farewell, which is an incredible, successful film out of Sundance a few years ago, scored by Alex Weston. On the panel today, I have composer Alex Weston, I have Stefan Karrer from Milan Records, and Rob Kleiner, music engineer and producer. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. Well, let's just start off the conversation really briefly about the creation of soundtracks. You know, they are the element that is pulled out of the movie that can live on its own. You know, you can't really pull costumes out of movies and distribute them worldwide. You know, like music is one of the few items that can actually be divorced from the picture, experienced on its own way, and be enjoyed by people around the world. Now, Alex, on scoring the Farewell, what sort of thought process were you putting in towards scoring that film? Were you thinking of a soundtrack in mind when you were scoring the film?
The soundtrack was pretty much not a consideration when we were scoring the movie. You know, we're really just focused on the story, but and how to use music to heighten that and elevate that. But one thing that Lulu Wong, the director of The Farewell, had in mind from the very beginning was you know, wanting these pieces of music to feel almost like they existed, like, you know, that they fit perfectly to support the scene, but, you know, there's not really moments where it's like, you know, really just a textural bed, nor are there moments where it's like, you know, a character winks and then you have like a ding or something like that. Like, it very much, when there is music in that movie, it is doing something that isn't happening on screen for the most part. Like, when there is music in that movie, there's very rarely any dialogue. It's very rarely used as underscore. So in that way, I think it works quite well as a soundtrack standing alone from the film, because the music, you know, has a very distinct beginning, middle, and end. It feels like a piece that exists. Even if it was a piece tailor-made to fit here, it feels like a standalone thing, like a conscientious piece of like capital M music and not capital U underscore. Does that make sense?
And when the film is coming out and when you're done, you've delivered the score, it's screening at Sundance, are you thinking about the soundtrack? Are you and Lulu, have you had conversations about how this is going to be distributed, or when did that first conversation happen?
Really, that conversation started happening pretty much immediately after the film arranged distribution. But, you know, there were very few kind of creative decisions to port that score in particular to the soundtrack. You know, there are other times you do a soundtrack where you have like 35 cues or something like that, but, you know, it might be a synth pad for 30 seconds to support it, and we didn't really, and sometimes, you know, those don't actually make it on the album because it's not really doing anything. It's like, I'll just leave this out, or the other cues that are really similar. Really, the conversation that was had for The Farewell in particular was more about sequencing. And just, you know, a lot of the cues, the score very much builds on a motif that is used throughout the entire movie. And, you know, especially in the beginning, there's 3 cues all in a row, which are very similar. But we wanted to use all of them because they were different enough. So we kind of used, you know, 3 of them sort of to split up the album a little bit. So we kind of come back to a recurring theme. Just make it flow more as, you know, like a cohesive album.
And Stefan, what was your experience as far as doing the deal with A24? Was this a film that you got to see ahead of time and then you decided that you really wanted to release this album? Or talk a little bit about the kind of discovery process of The Farewell.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wasn't at Sundance when the film came out, so I didn't see the film. What I did was I read reviews, obviously, and you know, I looked at who produced the film, Peter Saraf, and so he has a great track record of producing great movies, obviously. But you know, to be completely frank, before the film was even at Sundance, it was not on my radar. at all. And I'm not even sure when I first reached out to you, Alex. I mean, it's like 2 years ago, so it's all a bit fuzzy. But essentially what happened is, when I saw the reception or read about how well it was received at Sundance, that's essentially when, I started to reach out to Alex, to his manager, to Peter, and then to A24. And A24 is a company we work with quite a bit. And so fortunately, they were able to arrange a screening for us, for my colleague JC and myself. And, when we saw the film, we loved it. I mean, that's, it really, I think with us, it always starts with the film first. Like they say, the film starts with the script. For us, it's really all about the film first. If we love the film, the approach we take to soundtracks is, do we love the film? Essentially, is this something, we really care about? And then we go on to the next step.
And is that your discovery process overall, would you say, is kind of going off of obviously what you said as far as loving the film, but just kind of getting a general buzz out of festivals and early screenings? Talk a little bit about the decision-making process of your selection process when it comes to soundtracks.
Well, it always changes, I guess. There's never really and especially now, I mean, I've been doing this for 15 years, and, 15 years ago, it was all about going to the festivals and seeing the films there. And now I would say 9 out of 10 times, they send me a link and I watch the film on my computer or on my TV. And what's interesting is, when you attend the festival, there's always this kind of festival dynamic, and this can be very good or it can be very treacherous. And in the past, we definitely made some mistakes because a film was able to get incredible buzz at the festival. Everything thought this was the best thing ever. But then, 2-3 months later, things really changed. The distributor all of a sudden, second guessed their decision of buying the film. So we've definitely made that mistake. I think the challenge now, of course, watching the film by myself on my computer, is that I don't have the audience. And so especially if I'm not the target audience, it's much more difficult to judge. If you are in a theater with, 200 people, there's always going to be a reaction. And then at least, if a joke works, even if it doesn't work for me, it might work for, a lot of other people. So that's definitely the thing that's missing now.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, but in short, I mean, it's always, there's always a lot of luck involved, and just trying to figure out what people might like. I mean, you see the film, no one can predict if the film is going to be successful, even once the film is done. Then it's always a matter of, will people care about this? Will they like this? So there's always this part, where we don't have answers to.
Right, of course. And I'm sure every film distributor has the same questions. Just because one audience room likes it, will a nation or a world enjoy the same film the same way? Well, let's talk about the next step. So, you've done the deal, you're making the soundtrack. What goes into the decision-making process of sequencing? I know, Alex, you mentioned this a little bit early on, into the themes that you chose to put on it. I know some songs also appear on it, or some covers. Can you just talk a little bit about the thought process that goes into making a track list?
Well, the thing with those 3 covers is they serve a sort of kind of interesting role in the movie in particular. Like one of the covers is straight up diegetic music. It is an aunt at the wedding singing an aria. So they had to record it. And kind of a fun tangent about that is, on the recording we did, Lulu is playing piano on that one track, whereas for the rest of the album, I played piano on everything, but we just kind of thought it'd be fun to have her hidden as the piano on one of the tracks of the movie. So that one key cover song works as like I said, a diegetic moment replacing audio in the film. The other song, which is the only needle drop song, which is a cover of Come Healing by Leonard Cohen, is a particularly moving moment in the movie. But what's interesting is that was very intentionally one of the first things like in my involvement with this project, when I got introduced to Lulu, you know, I did a couple things on spec to try to get hired for the project, which is fairly standard. And the first spec I did was she wanted me to arrange "Come Healing." Like getting the mood for that moment of the movie was so important to her that we started from something that wasn't even really the proper score. um, in terms of where it fits in the soundtrack, um, because "Come Healing" is such an important moment and is the cover with Elena Boynton singing it, who has an unbelievable voice. You know, in the movie, it's the very end, it's the last thing before the credits, and that we really wanted to move way to the front of the record because it's like, in a weird way, we kind of felt like that was the single. So we had a couple tracks of soundtrack to kind of set the world of the movie and the mood of the score, and then we really wanted to really showcase this piece because I mean, it came out sounding great. It's one of the parts of the score that I'm most proud of, and getting to work with Elena was amazing. Similarly, we used the opera aria, which is the one with those playing piano on. We kind of wanted to use that to split up two sort of darker pieces of the score later, you know, just because we didn't want to keep it all starting to feel like kind of dreary, but these two keys were good back to back, so we thought it'd be good to kind of break it with this kind of, it's almost kind of goofy that it goes into like a proper aria in the middle of a soundtrack album, so that seemed like a good moment to break it. Similar thing, which was there's one other track on the album which isn't necessarily a cover, but we had like a sort of doo-wop vocal jazz version of Beethoven Sonata, which is like the kind of like scatting solo vocal line one. And similarly, we just kind of had to like, we knew we wanted it on the album, but that was sort of a tricky one to place because it's so different from everything else on the record. So that was similarly trying to find a place where that fit, and where it ended up working pretty well, I thought, was next to two tracks that it sounded the least like. Really just to kind of be a total left turn, a total departure from where the flow kind of was there. Which I think makes it, I don't know, kind of interesting, just having these covers split up the otherwise fairly homogenous orchestration and tone. I think they do a good job keeping that interesting.
So it sounds like a lot of thought process goes into the listener experience on a soundtrack. It's not necessarily the sequential order of the music as appears in the film, just on an album. In this circumstance, were you making suites of cues or anything, or were the cues just as they appeared in the film?
They are mostly as they appear in the film. There's one track on it. It's I think track 4, Changhyun, I think it's called. Changhyun, I'm pronouncing the town totally wrong. The name of that cue is, I think that's the only one which I think actually became a melody.
Got it. And then when it comes down to mixing, let's bring in Rob now. Rob, I was taking a look at your amazing credits as an engineer and work in vocals and stuff with amazing pop artists, and now you're obviously working in soundtracks. What is the mixing process like? What is the direction that you're receiving? And can you talk a little bit about the listener experience, you know, from the film mix of the cue to the soundtrack mix of the cue?
Yeah, usually, you know, a good mix, I'm not changing too much. It's not going to be drastically different. It's mostly going over things with like a fine-tooth comb and, you know, making sure that anything that's popping out in the wrong way is not popping out in the wrong way, or something that's hidden in a way that you want to hear a little bit more of it. It's, you know, it's just kind of striking you know, finding the perfect balance with a fine-tooth comb. And, you know, it's I think a lot of times when somebody's composing for film, they're not, as Alex said, he's not kind of thinking about this is going to be an album, you know, that somebody's going to be listening to songs sequentially. And so there's, you know, there's important things for your ears when you're listening to an album rather than listening to music on a screen. You know, priorities become a little different in some ways. And, you know, like a mix engineer is just kind of addressing those, you know, to help the listening experience for the album.
I was just thinking, of course, when you're mixing a track of into a film, you're competing with other audio sources, sound effects, birds, dialogue, and everything like that. So when you are getting the track, are you then kind of just expanding that audio experience because those elements are no longer kind of layered on top of it?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. It's like I said, there are things that you don't need to worry about so much when you're putting the music into a film, but you do very much need to worry about when you're putting presenting the music as an album, like you said, because now you're not competing with a visual or you know any in picture sound that's going on top of it, without a doubt. Yeah.
Do you have any examples of engineering and mixing these tracks, whether it's from The Farewell or from your past experiences, where you felt it was kind of a major change or a really necessary change?
Yeah, like I said, usually there's not going to be a massive change in it. It's usually like somebody's going to be buying the soundtrack, right, because they love what they heard in the movie. So it usually doesn't go through a massive metamorphosis. Sometimes, like you were talking about a little bit with the one cue from The Farewell, you're combining a couple songs, to make a medley, due to like time reasons, or maybe you're editing something down for time reasons. But I honestly, it's a fun gig because a lot of it is just me letting the music speak for itself.
Excellent. And Stefan, can you talk a little bit about this kind of new era of soundtracks? Growing up, I remember soundtracks as being pretty exclusively song-based, pre-existing tracks that were, put in by the music supervisor. And now soundtracks seem to have morphed into more original content, original songs, original compositions. Do you have any sort of feedback on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's changed quite dramatically, actually. That's true. And I just want to point out to what Alex said before. I mean, he did, and Lulu, I guess, the two of them did a really, really great job putting the album together. I mean, we were totally hands off, and we did not get involved. Alex sent us, hey, this is the album. Does that work? And we're like, yeah, absolutely. And the emphasis on the original songs is really important now, and I'm putting on my business hat in that sense, because almost all the music is already available. The pre-existing music is available on Spotify, it's available on Apple, it's available on lots of playlists. And so that changes the entire dynamic, because now, back in the day, as you mentioned, we would license a pre-existing song to put on a soundtrack, which, in the end was in a way a compilation, as you said. But now, and then obviously was sold as, CD or cassette or whatever. I mean, cassette is before my time, but CDs, that's where I started. And so now when you see where the CDs sales are, and the download sales also are really, falling off a cliff, it's all about streaming. But when it comes to streaming, it's, as I mentioned, these pre-existing songs are already on the streaming platform. So we, as a label, are not able to secure streaming rights, because the labels who control these masters, they're like, no, I mean, they're already on the streaming site, so we're not going to give you these rights. So what we have to do now is we have to focus exclusively almost on original songs, original score. And that's why all of a sudden what you see is this, this really focus on even a cover, as long as it's a new recording that's not available, that's really what we're aiming for and trying to release, because this is a new master, and we are the first ones to release it. And so for The Farewell, these original songs, obviously, and even the cover, they play a very, very important role in the entire marketing also and selling of the album.
Yeah, absolutely. I realize, Rob, the one question I would love to know that is what is mastering? This is a word that I hear tossed around, and I hear albums need to be mastered. we need to set aside time for mastering. What, can you just give us a rundown? What is that exactly?
Sure. It's like putting the final gloss on the music. It's like I don't even know if I would call it like the paint job to the car, more like the wax you put on after the paint job, maybe. Um, it there's a lot of elements to it. It can be as simple as making sure the song kind of fades out in the right way or ends, after that final note or whatever is held out for kind of the right amount of time, to making sure the tracks, one song from another isn't super quiet versus the next one being super loud and dynamic. And it's also doing the same thing with the frequencies, making sure, everything kind of is at, reasonable and pleasing, levels for the listener's ear to kind of listen to the songs as one set, as an album.
And do you feel like there's ways to mess up a mastering, or is there different approaches to mastering something for a vinyl soundtrack versus a streaming soundtrack?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely ways to mess up a mastering, a master. It's again, if you're not paying attention to how things flow in and out of each other, and also, you want to be comparing your soundtrack with other soundtracks that are already out in the world. You don't want to have something that's, just sonically inferior to, anything else somebody else might choose to listen to. You want to make sure everything kind of sits on par, within the genre you're working in. And sorry, what was your second question?
Well, the question was about like the differences like for doing a vinyl soundtrack release versus like a streaming.
Yeah, okay, there's technical differences in that when people are distributing vinyl, they can take your files at a higher sample and bit rate than you can for streaming services. So when I'm turning in a vinyl master, it's actually usually closer to what the music was recorded at versus when I'm submitting something for streaming, you're kind of, I don't want to say dumbing it down, but you're making it more compressed, more like an MP3, which is meant for like quick listening and quick downloading. So you kind of get a better fidelity with I masters things at different fidelities basically between the two. Also, if you want to get really into it, then like old vinyl, sometimes there's a thing where it doesn't handle bass frequencies in the same way as like modern sound systems traditionally do. So a lot of times like there's a trick is to make the bass mono on a vinyl recording, which you don't necessarily have to worry about so much on a streaming master. So yeah, just a few things like that, but usually they're not all that different sonically.
Got it. Now, sounds like the album is put together. We've got the track list, we've got the mastering, we're set. Now what? How does the album get out? Stefan, do you have any sort of feedback about distribution and working with physical media and streaming platforms?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one thing that we should remember is that physical is not dead, even though, it always depends on what you look at. So compared to 15, 20 years, yes, CDs are, they're dead in that sense. But if you look at the absolute number, we can still ship quite a few CDs. I mean, it's not going to be necessarily 10,000, but it could be 1,000 or it could be 1,500. So there's definitely some revenue there, and there's obviously stores you need to interact with. And then when it comes to vinyl, I think the one thing that's great about, well, there's two things that are great about vinyl is there's definitely a crowd out there who's very interested in vinyl. That's the first thing, and the second, they're patient. So, it's not as critical to have the vinyl out at the same time as you have the CD and the digital version. So, but yes, then when it comes to the key now of how we distribute music, it's obviously streaming, be it Amazon, Spotify, Apple, Deezer, Tidal, what have you. And to make, to be, I think, in a good position, you want to make sure these services get the music at least 4 or 5, ideally 6 weeks before the release. And that can often be a challenge, especially with, soundtracks. I don't honestly remember how it was with The Farewell. Maybe Alex remembers it. I think it was fairly last minute, maybe not like super last minute, but it was, it's always, it can be a bit of a struggle sometimes with the soundtrack, because for many people, and here I mean, maybe the director or maybe the producers, or sometimes even the distributors of the film, the soundtrack is an afterthought. So what might be the big priority for the composer and for me, obviously, it could be an afterthought for a lot of other people involved in the film, because in the end, the film is the most important. I mean, we can't fool ourselves. Otherwise, I think it's really just really important to have the album out on time. Especially when it comes to streaming and CD, as I mentioned. If the album is out late, you're definitely missing a window. You're not just missing a window with the fans, but you're potentially also missing a window, getting playlisting from Spotify, from Apple, and all the different DSPs.
I definitely want to talk about playlisting in just a second, but a question for Alex. Is soundtracks like a really essential element for you as a composer? Like when you are working in this business and you are working specifically in film projects, is that kind of like a dream for you, just to see your product released like that and have people be able to experience the music?
I mean, soundtracks are totally crucial. And I say with somewhat limited experience. I mean, to be honest, the Farewell soundtrack was my first real soundtrack release, with a label or anything like that. But really, like, there are people who hear the soundtrack who don't see the movie or don't know about the movie. I got a feature film project that I scored at the end of last year, which I still working on this festival premiere thing. But the way I got that project was the director came across The Farewell on like a studying playlist, and that's how she had heard about the movie, never got around to checking it out, came across the soundtrack, and then I ended up getting hired for the project out of that. So thanks for getting that listed, Stefan. But yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely totally crucial. It's there, and it's especially with the Farewell soundtrack, it's been really cool and very strange that some cues from that in particular, some people have really, really taken to. And seeing that it still gets the streams that it does, like 2 years later, like people are still listening to it, which means I think people really connected with it. So, they're not going to throw on the movie every time they think about it, but to have the soundtrack like that readily accessible, I think is totally important and totally helpful.
Well, awesome. I love the story of the playlist discovery. So back on that topic, Stefan, can you just talk a little bit about that process and the submission, and kind of people are always asking about how do I get my music on playlists on Spotify. So I'd be very curious to hear your feedback on that.
Well, to be completely frank, I don't pitch the music to Spotify, so thanks, Alex, but that wasn't me. Those are my colleagues in the sales and commerce departments, so they pitch the music to the different playlists. Now, the advantage that we have at Sony is that we have our own filter playlists. So if you see something, like a filter playlist, FILTR, that's actually a Sony playlist. And, Sony, and especially the Masterworks department, started these playlists very early on. So some of them have a lot of followers, some of them have 500,000 followers. And obviously it's much easier for us to get a track on one of these playlists than, to get it on an official Spotify or Apple playlist. So that's the first distinction. Then the other thing, of course, is, I listen to albums still, but from what I hear is that, most fans just listen to playlists when they work or when they read or, whatever they do when they drive or commute. And so, yes, having a song on a playlist can make a huge, huge difference because essentially the store is always open and people are always listening to the music in that store. So I think that's why overall I'm very hopeful about the music industry, because I think, I mean, back when I started, it was all about if the CD is in stores, that's when you sell the CD, and when the CD is not in stores, that's when it's over. And then with the downloads, of course, the downloads are always in the stores, but that doesn't mean that people constantly buy them. And now with streaming, if you're on a playlist and that playlist gets listened to, then they listen to your music. And we had a few surprises of earlier releases. I forgot the title of the track now, but all of a sudden it ended up on a playlist. And even though it was a film from 2008, in 2018 it was one of the best streaming tracks that we had in our catalog. So all of a sudden, that music gets rediscovered. So yeah.
It's been kind of funny seeing I log into my Spotify for artists account. It kind of shows you what tracks are on what playlists, or I'll get like an email when a couple of tracks have gotten added, even recently still, which is great. Like 2 Spotify editorial ones, but it's kind of funny which ones it gets added to. Sometimes like there's a couple tracks from the farewell. I don't know if you saw this or if you've seen this, Stefan, but it's like got added to like horoscope astrology playlists, like music for Aquariuses and Capricorns and Sagittariuses. And so I think the farewell's on like 3 or 4 of those, but there are 3 or 4 different tracks. And I really want to know how someone was like, oh, well, track 4, this one's for Sagittariuses. Like, I don't know if there's some astrological process I don't know about, but apparently there's.
It's just the alignment. It's the alignment
there's
of the queue.
distinctions on that soundtrack, I guess.
Well, on that note, Alex, why don't you talk a little bit about Spotify artist page? How did you claim your artist page? How do you interact with it? Because there might be people that don't quite understand that process.
The Spotify page was just sort of easy to set up because I had a few albums and things that I had just, uploaded through, I think, DistroKid, just, some self-released or like more independent projects and just albums and things. So I think I just sort of, I think I had to send like an ID or something or send an email and I got access to it. And it's, it shows you statistics and where things are being playlisted or when things are added, and you can see where the streams are coming from, which is really interesting. I have no idea about Apple Music. I've tried to claim my artist page, but they refuse to believe me that I'm me. I keep trying, so I have no idea about Apple. But Spotify was easy.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for being on this panel. I think this is a great kind of a snapshot about the soundtrack process, because there's plenty of soundtrack fans out there. And as Stefan, you mentioned, there's so many people listening to these playlists online, discovering new music that happens to be on soundtracks from whatever 2008 to now. And I'm really glad that you guys all took the time to speak with us here at Film Music House. So thank you very much.